In Section 7, we're going to continue with evaluating sourcing opportunities, macro considerations, now looking at industry and supporting infrastructure by country. As it relates to industry and supporting infrastructure, one of the first things we want to look at is the size of specific industries that we're interested in. If we are an importer of wearing apparel, obviously we want to know the size of that industry in a given country. If we're more into consumer electronics or foodstuffs or medical equipment, we have to study the size of those specific industries. That's what we mean. As part of that overall study, the production capacity of relevant industries is also quite important. And in that vein, we're not just talking about the size of an industry. It could be a very large industry in a given country, but how much production capacity remains for new sourcing opportunities to take place. Another key feature of an analysis of an industry and its supporting infrastructure is the geographic clusters that exist within a country of the industries we are interested in. Oftentimes, depending on the development stage of a country, industry-specific clusters do exist. China is a good example of that. Mexico is another example. Automotive clusters outside of Mexico City and places like Puebla, Toluca, San Luis Potosí, more high-tech clusters around the cities of Monterrey and Guadalajara in southwestern Mexico. More advanced countries have a tendency to have those clusters to study. As part of those clusters, one might consider, as we see in our last sub-bullet point, the structure of Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 suppliers. We've talked about Tier 1, 2, and 3 suppliers and the role they play in supplying actual manufacturers. Tier 1s have the direct contact with a major manufacturing entity. Tier 2 suppliers sell to the Tier 1, Tier 3 to the Tier 2. It's not a bad idea, as part of a structural analysis, to look at those Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 suppliers. Essentially, an analysis of where our vendors are going to be getting their raw materials. Other considerations include the origin of and access to raw materials. That's related to the Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 story, but sometimes raw materials are being imported by our vendors from other countries. It's good to know where those raw materials are coming from, because that goes into the products that are being made on our behalf. Any identification of state-owned enterprises in places like China, where the Chinese government is very involved in ownership, it's important to know that. In a broader sense, what is the capacity of nearby ports and airports? How big is an ocean port as it relates to the ability to accommodate the export of goods from origin countries? How many terminals are there? How big are the berths? What size ships can they accommodate? Same goes for airport capacity. How long is the runway? What size aircraft can land and take off there? Those are important things to understand. And then, as it relates to ocean freight, the steamship line schedules and their loops, the actual ports that they call on. That's going to help us to determine at least the ocean transportation component of cumulative lead time. As a quick trade tip, all steamship lines publish their sailing loops and schedules online. Names of ships, dates, transit time. It's very helpful in building that aspect of cumulative lead time compilation. Other considerations relevant to industry and supporting infrastructure: access to air cargo flights. Passenger flights are one thing, but we always want to look at airports in close proximity to our overseas vendors that have a lot of cargo flights. It's just a greater capacity to handle cargo. Sometimes U.S. importers don't think about those things, but it's an important consideration, especially if there's a crunch on demand for space on cargo flights. We want all cargo aircraft as opposed to a combination of passenger and cargo. Local, state, and national highway system, really important to consider. Paved roads, another consideration. As a part of that, the location and condition of bridges and tunnels. If our vendors don't have access to ports of export and airports of export, that's going to represent a major challenge for us. Something we here in the States don't oftentimes think about because it is so reliable is the actual reliability of the power grid. Unfortunately, countries outside of the United States have challenges with their grid, and it does go down more often than not. That's going to dig into the production capacity of a plant because a plant can't run without power. We need some information on the reliability of the power grid. Here's a real-world example, close to home actually, here in the United States, that revolves around infrastructure capabilities. It's entitled The Raising of the Bayonne Bridge. A key element of any sourcing analysis is an evaluation of a country's industrial and supporting infrastructure. Many a U.S. importer has found quality suppliers in countries where the infrastructure around ports and airports, highways, bridges, and tunnels was actually lacking. A great example of inadequate infrastructure can be found right here in the U.S. in the case of the Bayonne Bridge. The Bayonne Bridge connects the state of New Jersey with Staten Island, and in doing so, traverses a shipping channel that accesses 4 terminals at the New York and New Jersey port complex. Whereas what's referred to as the navigational clearance of the bridge was fine when it opened in 1931, it was high enough to accommodate ships, modern-era container ships could no longer get under the bridge and as such were out of reach of 3 of the 4 aforementioned terminals. After a lengthy project, the Bayonne Bridge reopened in June of 2017 with a new navigational clearance of 215 feet. This project not only cleared the way for 18,000 TEU ships, 20-foot equivalency unit ships, to access multiple terminals, it also created the opportunity for larger ships to call on other East Coast ports, meaning those big ships would not just call on New York, New Jersey, but Baltimore, Philadelphia, Charleston, Norfolk, etc. Combined with the widening of the Panama Canal, this project represents one of the most important trade-related infrastructure projects in recent U.S. history. And it's just a good example of how U.S. importers, when looking at overseas countries to source from, have to be thinking about infrastructure capability. Continuing on with macro considerations related to industry and supporting infrastructure, wireless infrastructure and the ability to get online. How about the public transportation network for people to actually get to work at the factories from whom we're buying merchandise? Housing for employees is another big deal. In China, for example, many employees actually live at the factory. Is it adequate housing? Is it humane housing? Does it meet international standards for quality housing? We need to be thinking about those things. And then, of course, related to wireless infrastructure, for cellular phones and other devices, but broadband access and penetration, that internet piece we spoke of just a moment ago. Changing up a little bit with our macro considerations, what is a potential sourcing country's attitude towards international trade, the government's attitude towards international trade? Are they pro-free trade? Are they protectionist? That's going to matter. So we can start out with an analysis of government, industry, and academia's position on global trade. What is their position on exporting from their country to other countries? As we said, are they protectionist or globalist in terms of their posture and trade policy? Second to the last sub-bullet, does that country have any preferential duty programs, or probably more relevant for our conversation, any free trade agreements where U.S. companies not only import from those countries, but we can export to those countries with equal access to markets as well? Other factors on attitude towards international trade, an important one, what is called RVC, Regional Value Content Requirements. RVC is normally found in a free trade agreement where there are certain requirements for raw materials that have to be of the origin of the countries that participate in the free trade agreement, have to be incorporated into a product in order to qualify as a product of that country or free trade region. RVC is important to consider. Any government programs promoting export trade from the countries that we're thinking about importing from. What's the regulatory environment, especially as it relates to non-tariff barriers to trade? Any type of requirement that impedes the purchase of goods overseas and the export of those goods from a sourcing country. Import-export license requirements. For us as an importer, we're more interested in the country that we're considering sourcing from if they have any export license requirements. Their companies needing an export license to ship goods to us in the United States. And local content rules, which is very similar, if not synonymous with regional value content. As we said, RVC is oftentimes used within a specific free trade agreement. Local content rules really don't require any type of free trade agreement. These are just rules put in place by the country from which we may be sourcing from. That would impact access to and the cost of raw materials that go into the products that we're buying. Let's talk about a real-world example as it relates to trade policy. And by no surprise, we're going to have another look at China. Dating back to the 1980s, China has served as the world's factory for products as diverse as wearing apparel, home improvement, and industrial goods. Driven initially by low-cost production for labor-intensive industries, the Chinese government has gradually channeled its business sectors to more sophisticated verticals, industries, that aren't as reliant on cheap prices. One of the more prominent displays of the above trade policy can be seen in the Made in China 2025 initiative. With a focus on transitioning away from low-wage and low-value-added sectors, this policy explicitly states that it is China's goal to dominate high-tech industries by the year 2025. Of particular interest is China's commitment to not just assembling high-tech products, but moving further up the supply chain to research and development, product design, engineering, and software coding. U.S. importers must be cognizant of this policy as they seek to improve existing sourcing strategies or undertake new ones. With China closing down sunset industries, as they're sometimes called, due to pollution and access to fewer workers from its one-child policy, the world's factory may not be as viable a sourcing location as it once was. China has evolved a great deal in the last 30 to 40 years. There are certain industries that the government wants to move away from, low cost, low value added. We need to know that as we're looking for long-term opportunities to source from. Within that context, China may or may not be the place to look. The point is that we as sourcing people need to understand a potential country's policy towards industrial development and how that benefits or impedes what we are trying to achieve. Wrapping up on macro considerations for attitudes towards international trade, any product inspection requirements or capabilities at origin, that's a non-tariff barrier to trade. Any other type of non-tariff barrier to trade, limited access to foreign currency as an example. Does a country have any cases of anti-dumping and or countervailing duties where that country or companies within that country aren't playing fairly as it relates to World Trade Organization standards? And do the countries we're looking at, are they members in any international organizations? The WTO, we've mentioned a bunch of times, the World Trade Organization, the World Customs Organization as well, and the UN, the United Nations. As a trade tip, for purposes of classifying goods via the harmonized system, it is very important that a potential sourcing country be a member of the World Customs Organization. Why is that? Because it's the WCO, not the WTO, that manages the harmonized system. It's just a good idea to be thinking about sourcing countries that are a part of the WCO, and as such, use the harmonized system. Last slide in this section, a supply chain perspective on product testing capabilities. Depending on the nature of an imported product, it may require testing against a number of potential dangers, many of which we've talked about. For example, toy products imported into the U.S. require testing against things like lead content, flammability, and choke hazards. Tests must be conducted by certified labs, many of which are located in countries like China and Taiwan. Countries that have been exporting toys for a long time have a much more established infrastructure of labs. As such, suppliers in an experienced country can send samples to a lab without excessive expense or time delay. However, as some industries, like toys, continue to migrate away from countries such as China and Taiwan due to increased labor costs, U.S. importers find it difficult to contract with labs in new exporting countries. The infrastructure of available product testing labs in a given country and a potential country to source from has to be established. We have to know what that infrastructure is and what it's capable of. Any importer of goods with test requirements should be sure to evaluate the product testing infrastructure within any country they are considering to source from. If they don't, they may find themselves having to pay for samples to be sent outside of the new country and not only incur additional shipping costs, but lose valuable time while items are in transit. Sometimes companies don't think of these things when they're looking at new countries to source from. If an importer's product or products are subject to product testing, this is something very important to think about. That's the end of this section. When we come back, we'll wrap things up on our macro considerations with a talk on demographics.